next speaker, Vitalik Buterin, is a co-founder and inventor of Ethereum and helps to lead the Ethereum Foundation. He'll be talking about algorithms and mechanisms for funding public goods, giving a view of the latest thinking around novel public funding experiments and exciting new projects in the ecosystem. Welcome.
Thank you very much, and it's good to be here. So I will today focus on some public goods funding in the Ethereum ecosystem, and some of the very specific experiments and specific learnings that the Ethereum ecosystem has had from its attempts to fund public goods that the ecosystem needs in order to survive and prosper, and just see how some of those learnings might be applicable to public goods funding in the future. So blockchain communities are a very natural fit for public goods, interestingly enough. I say this is interesting because a lot of the early ideology of blockchains is really focused on private goods. It's focused on things like creating really powerful and robust individual property rights, creating markets, creating systems for trade, creating decentralized exchanges, and similar things. But public goods are actually hugely important to blockchain communities. So just to give a few examples of this, public goods that are critical for things like the Bitcoin community, the Ethereum community, other blockchain communities to survive. Open source client code is a very big one, right? So to connect to the Ethereum network, you need to have an Ethereum client. The Ethereum client interprets the Ethereum rules. It needs to be able to process transactions quickly. Work needs to go on into making the clients upgrade into and support all of the latest protocol features that the community wants to add. You need a whole lot of very hard work on optimization to increase scalability. Like even the Ethereum blockchain itself, it's the gas limit has increased by a factor of 5 since the platform launched in 2015. And there's just a lot of work that went into that and went into simultaneously making it safer. So open source client code is a public good. If you create a client, a piece of software that someone can use to connect to the network, then you basically have to make it open source, because if you don't make it open source, then people are not going to trust it. And if you do make it open source, then anyone can go and copy it. So you either are offering it to the entire community or you're offering it to no one, right? So that's a classic example of public good. Protocol research, the math, cryptography, analysis, auditing, everything that goes into actually creating upgrades to the Ethereum protocol, 100% public good. Documentation, things to help people understand what's going on in Ethereum, things that help people actually get into Ethereum, understand what the different parts of the ecosystem are up to, how to use some different pieces of software, also very much a public good. And community building, like just doing things like running meetups, running online events, running just doing all sorts of activities to help people in the community link together and talk to each other. There's definitely a private good component to that. Like if you run a meetup, then theoretically you could charge for it and people would be willing to pay because they want to listen. But there's also very large positive spillovers that happen as a result, right? Like if someone does become understand the Ethereum ecosystem better, they're more likely to contribute. And so if you just try to run all of that community building with a kind of private goods oriented mechanisms, like making people pay to attend everything, then you're going to end up getting much less community building work happening than the amount that actually makes sense for the community. So in blockchain communities, public goods are hugely important, and public goods are, I think, more important even than private goods. So if public goods are so important, then there's this next question, right, of how do we actually fund the public goods? So the problem of funding public goods can be broken up into two major subproblems. One subproblem is, where does the money come from? And the second subproblem is, what mechanism decides who receives the money? So where does the money come from, right? So In the crypto community in general, I think there's four major sources that we've seen. One is individual donations. There have been plenty of cases of individuals donating money to core developers, individuals donating money to teams. This happens all the time. Corporate donations are another one. So this could happen through corporations giving donations of money directly, or it could also happen through corporations hiring employees to work on public good projects. So for example, in the Bitcoin community, Blockstream hires Bitcoin core devs. In the Ethereum community, Consensus, for example, has hired a lot of people that end up doing core development work on Ethereum. So this also happens a lot. And corporate donations are definitely more scalable than individual donations because like with individual donations, you have this property, right? That like every dollar donated to public goods is a dollar that's sacrificed by one individual person. And so either you need that one individual person to be very, very altruistic, or you need them to benefit personally by more than $1 from the from that public good. So the public good just has to be such an amazing big deal that it's in that one person's interest to support it. With corporate donations, like you get leverage, right? Because the corporation is not one person's money. The corporation is a lot of people's money. The individual decision makers, like it's not like they personally lose $10,000 if they give $10,000 to some to some public good project. The corporation even benefits from social status in some way. So it's a step up, but still not sufficient. And also, if you rely on corporate donations, then one of the big negative externalities you end up receiving is you often end up getting a lot of centralized control over the public goods, which is something we want to avoid. One-time pre-mines and one-time pre-sales. So Ethereum is a good example of this. Basically, the initial issuance of Ethereum, 11.9 million of those coins were pre-mined. So they were given to the people that did a lot of the initial work in making Ethereum possible, and also went into the Ethereum Foundation, which is still using them to fund ongoing expenses today. And then finally, ongoing issuance and redirected fees. So like Zcash, right? Zcash has ongoing issuance, which gets sent currently to the Zcash Foundation and the Electric Coin Company. And that process is continually iterated through basically the same off-chain governance that decides protocol upgrades. So these are the four sources right now, right? And I think they have their different strengths and weaknesses. Individual donations are nice, but they're also insufficient. Corporate donations are somewhat more sufficient, but still not quite. And if you rely on them too much, you get centralized control. One-time pre-mines and pre-sales are nice in that you get an amount of money that's just directly dedicated to creating the public goods, but it's only one time. And ongoing issuance, the problem with ongoing issuance is that you're basically giving money into a permanent thing, and that permanent thing, you have to think really hard about how it's governed, and you have to think really hard to make sure that it's actually being governed well, and deal with the risk of that governance being captured. So public goods funding needs to be long-term and systematic, right? Public goods are a very big and systematic problem. They are a long-term problem. Therefore, they need a long-term and systematic solution. So this means that we need funding to come from not just individuals and also not just companies, because companies too can disappear, but from applications and or protocols. So that is the first kind of part of the question, right? And when I say applications and or protocols, there's many possibilities. It doesn't need to be the Ethereum protocol itself. It could be layer 2 protocols, right? Like Optimism, for example, is doing retroactive funding rounds for the Ethereum ecosystem. The Uniswap DAO has funded quite a few Ethereum-wide public goods. So there's a lot of potential funding sources and I think at the kind of application and layer 2 protocol layer, there's opportunity to be flexible that does not exist at layer 1. What mechanism decides the recipients? So One is a centralized small committee. So basically like the Ethereum Foundation Grants Committee. Another possibility is quadratic funding. So Gitcoin has been doing some quadratic funding recently. And then possibly there could be other mechanisms as well, right? So this is the question of, given a pool of money, how does that pool of money actually get distributed? So Moloch DAO was this interesting experiment that's been happening in Ethereum land for the last, like, I think at least 3 years now. Basically, it's a DAO consisting of some major like ETH holders and Ethereum contributors, and they just like pool some of their money together, kind of assurance contract style. So it's this kind of collective individual donation, and then they basically have a DAO, and that DAO votes on like where the funding ends up actually going. So Moloch DAO has funded a lot of interesting things. Definitely, it's funded some kind of like ecosystem reports. It's funded Tornado Cash. It's funded some a lot of other things. So it is small. The amount of funding in it is not huge, but it's I'd say it's still one of those kind of alternative grant givers that's been punching above its weight. Gitcoin grants. So this is an experiment in quadratic funding, right? This is this quadratic voting inspired mechanism for choosing where public goods get funded to. And it's a type of voting, except you basically vote by giving donations. And the donations that individuals give are small, but then there is also this central matching pool, and the matching pool gets allocated between the projects using a formula that takes into account how many donations each project got and from how many different people those donations came from. So Gitcoin grants has been running in the Ethereum ecosystem for a few years. Community grants, some infra grants. So there's these different sections for grants. There's one round roughly every 2 or 3 months. So we see a lot of interesting projects get funded on the community side. A lot of interesting projects get funded on the infrastructure side. A lot of other projects have been funded lately. And it has become a very stable source of revenue for, I think, at least some participants. Like Bankless, for example, gets a significant amount of funding every round. I think like Bankless is definitely getting funded enough that David and Ryan can like basically have have enough to be able to live comfortably. Like this is $30,000, and they're getting amounts roughly on this order once every couple of months. Ethereum Magicians, ETH Hub imports community resource, and then some Ethereum clients, some Umbra, and other interesting privacy solution. So a lot of things have already been funded by Gitcoin grants. And Gitcoin grants is interesting, right? Because anyone can vote. And so it really does kind of source this very wide and diverse community input. And so it ends up funding different projects from the kinds of projects that retro funding the projects that kind of more centralized committees end up funding by themselves. So now, right, retroactive funding. So retroactive funding is this new idea that I have been working on with Optimism, and actually Optimism's retro funding round 1 recently finished, and they released the results about I think a week and a half ago. And the idea with retro funding is, instead of funding projects in anticipation of future work, you fund them in recognition of work that has already been done. So instead of the retro funding mechanism having the job of making predictions, where making predictions is hard and often relying on these kind of conformist voting mechanisms to make predictions just leads to them missing really important things. Instead, you just let people do whatever projects they want to do. And if something happens that turns out to have a really good impact, then they can make this, basically vote to reward that project for the work that they did. If there are projects that are considered long shot bets at the beginning, but succeed at the end, and they still need money to be funded, then you could combine retroactive funding with an investor ecosystem, right? Investors could invest in public good projects, and then if that project succeeds, and if that project gets a retro reward, then some of that retro reward could also go to the investors. Now, obviously, for this to work, there has to be a pretty big sized retro funding pool and a pretty consistent retro funding pool. But this is one of the nice things about Optimism doing this, right? Like their roll-up is getting hundreds of thousands of dollars of transaction fees every day. And now, obviously, like, most of that has to go to paying the sequencer, but or sorry, to paying gas fees for the call data on L1, but some of that still goes to like basically excess profits for the sequencer. And the plan is to take a lot of that revenue and put that into these retro rounds. So retro round 1 was $1 million, and it's likely that the retro rounds are going to be bigger in the future. So now, of course, with retro funding, like there's still the question of like, well, what kind of voting mechanism decides like how this funding actually happens, right? And with retro funding, we're like, the optimism experiment is taking this interesting route using what we call badge holders, basically a medium-sized set of technical experts that are at the beginning handpicked, but then over time, mechanisms can be added to kind of choose and add new ones in a more decentralized way. And so it's not coin voting. It's like, as I've written in other contexts, I think cryptocurrency governance needs to move beyond this kind of this idea that pure coin voting is the only legitimate kind of decentralization. So this badge holder thing is interesting as an alternative. It's not coins, but it's also a much bigger committee than you would get in pretty much any traditional centralized team. So where is this all going to go in the future, right? I think, first of all, public goods funding in Ethereum is necessary, and public goods funding has to be systematic. And I think more public goods funding in Ethereum is going to be possible. I think we're going to see more large-scale application protocols and layer 2 protocols on Ethereum helping to fund public goods, both within their own ecosystems and within the broader Ethereum ecosystem. And I think once they are large enough, within the ecosystems going even far beyond Ethereum. Like, I want to see, Ethereum-based public goods funding and Filecoin-based public goods funding gadgets collaborate on, say, funding the open source virtual reality ecosystem, or funding open hardware, or even funding life extension research. I think once these mechanisms get big enough, they are going to be big enough that they'll be able to have a scope of concern far beyond these crypto ecosystems themselves. And they're going to be a potentially significant part of how hopefully humanity ends up building the 21st century. Now, of course, big vision, very dependent on crypto and blockchains continuing to succeed in order to be able to actually have the funding to realize that. But we'll see how it happens. And also, as these funding projects get bigger, ecosystems are going to form around these funding mechanisms, right? So there's going to be, I think, very soon what I call the first quadratic freelancer, like the first people who actually make enough money off of these quadratic funding rewards that they just rely on it as their source of income. I think Bankless might even be very, very close to there already. Well, I mean, they're basically are there already, though they also have some other revenue from sponsorships, and they're doing that for doing some other things as well. Eventually, we're going to see people doing kind of creating second layer infrastructure around these funding mechanisms. So things like quadratic funding block explorers, and then those projects themselves would get funded through quadratic funding or through retroactive funding. Eventually, we're going to see investors invest in early stage public good fund projects, early stage individuals or teams, partially in the hopes of getting rewarded through retroactive rewards. So as these projects get bigger, as these projects get more sustainable, then hopefully we're going to start seeing these ecosystems form, and then we are going to see this kind of very large and systematic ecosystem level wide effort on making sure all of these really important things in the Ethereum ecosystem and beyond actually can get funded. Thank you.
Thanks, Vitalik. That was a really great view on how we can take a long-term and systematic view to supporting public goods. And we actually have some time for questions. So I think I will highlight a few, if you don't mind, from the chat. I believe the first question had to do with what an exit looks like in this structure. So let me see if I can find that again. And so if we're talking, this is a question from Daniel Irwin in the chat. If we're talking about investing in the public, what does the exit look like? Is it like getting elected to run things? How else can you measure that the broader masses are better off or happier in this system?
How can we measure that the masses are better off? So like, how do you actually measure the, like, to what extent these public goods have been funded have actually been having an impact? I mean, I think in general, measuring impact is an incredibly complicated problem. I don't claim to have like very good solutions. I think like ultimately any mechanism that does get developed is going to have to be like what we call some kind of DAO with some kind of governance. But then like that's if it needs to be part of the protocol. But otherwise, like these rounds and the results are all completely open. The processes are transparent, so they're definitely fully available for anyone who wants to study and try to make conclusions off of the results to do that. And so like, I don't think that there is like, one correct way to measure. I just think that the only thing that we do need is just like a larger ecosystem of people analyzing and as discussing what's going on and trying to make conclusions about how to improve these mechanisms more going forward into the future.
Thank you for that. I'd like to remind the participants, you can still add questions in the chat. We have a few more minutes. I'm going to go to another question that's sort of prompted by what you just said about a lot of participants in this ecosystem. And I believe there was a question earlier from Dave Mackey about how does retroactive public goods funding scale? Can you sort of model that for us?
Sure. So I think like the main scaling problems with all of these mechanisms are like, one of them is just where to get more money for them, right? Like how do we actually get into a future where instead of these rounds being $1 million, they're $100 million? And so, we can seriously talk about like big parts of entire communities getting their money from them. I think to get like the most realistic route to get to that point, I personally think, is these applications and layer 2 protocols that I'm talking about, like really succeeding and actually getting an amount of revenue that can pay for those things. I think it's happening already, right? Like if you just look at Ethereum itself, like the amount of fees that it's getting are on the order of like $80 million a day right now. And so as the Ethereum ecosystem in particular moves to layer 2 in order to scale and have lower transaction fees, like the layer 2 protocols, I think at some points are going to start getting levels of fees that are of similar orders of magnitude to that. And so when that happens, like and when I think like other blockchains like an Filecoin succeeds, I think it's going to have a large amount of fees collected as well. So if those protocol fees can go into these decentralized public goods funding gadgets, then like that's already it's an improvement. I mean, I think that can get us to the next level. The second scaling problem is the scaling problem of governance. I think with quadratic funding, it's easier because like the whole mechanism is just very democratic. And so the more money there is, the more people care and the more voters you have. With retro funding, with the current badge holder system, there is this, there's a little bit more challenges because the way the badge holder system is currently structured is that it expects every badge holder to have an opinion about every project. I mean, I think even after round 1, we already recognize that that's completely unsustainable. And so how that evolves in the future, like would there be some kind of 2-level system? Would badge holders have to delegate their badges to kind of specialists in particular categories? Would something else happen? Like that's a discussion that I think would have to happen like specifically within the Optimism retro funding community. So I mean, these things are in general early stage experiments, and we'll do them, and as they grow, like we'll see challenges and we'll learn how to adapt to challenges.
Thank you. I've got just a few more. I've got a question here from Ben Reinhardt relating to Timescale. He mentioned that our first speaker, Juan, most of the things Juan was talking about in his presentation won't be valuable until long into the future, and it will require a lot of capital to get there. Is retroactive public goods funding applicable there?
I think it absolutely could be. It's one of those places where retroactive public goods funding could actually be really great. I think in order for that to actually work, though, people need to have confidence that this retroactive funding ecosystem actually will exist 50 years in the future, right? And like that itself is a big kind of legitimacy hump. Like I think 5 years ago, people were not convinced that crypto would be here 5 years in the future. And a lot has changed over the last 5 years already, right? And crypto, I think, is increasingly establishing itself as a major player of this new world that that we're coming into, right? Especially with major protocols literally having higher market caps with major banks and like being at the forefront of like say funding like a large portion of all the cryptography research out there, and also at the forefront of funding a lot of the life extension research out there. So it like I personally am more convinced than ever that crypto will be around in 10 years, will be around in 20 years. What it will be like in 50 years, and will crypto in 50 years be committed to making retroactive rewards? Again, it's an open problem. I think creating the like institutions that give people comfort that such things actually will happen is probably one of the big problems, one of the big challenges of the whole thing. I guess we'll see. I don't think there's a good answer now. I just think we have to be aware of this as a problem and just work toward kind of like creating these structures and then stabilizing them so people can be confident that they'll continue to exist further in the future.
Thanks a lot. And I have a question here that I think might be a clarification that some listeners may really appreciate from Cedric Barney. What is the difference between retro public goods funding and prizes?
I mean, I think arguably retroactive public goods funding is just another word for prizes. But I think in practice, the word prize tends to refer to prizes that are kind of relatively kind of specified within a particular category, right? Like, there's like the X prize for like doing some very particular space travel exercise. There's like the Methuselah mouse prize for like making a mouse live 10 years or whatever the number of years is. So retroactive public goods funding is much more generic. It just says, if you create anything that has a positive impact that gets recognized, then it can get rewarded, right? And that's really powerful because like it captures the long tail, right? It's not just about a few specific things that like the designers or funders today have are excited about and have high opinions of. It's like it's something much more open-ended that could capture things that are recognized as being important tomorrow. So like that obviously comes with higher governance challenges as well, because like you need to have this like open-ended or governance process that determines like what level of value some project provided in general. But like that's like trying to iterate toward that is the point of a lot of these experiments.
Thanks a lot for that really comprehensive answer and for being so generous with your time. At this point, I will retroactively acknowledge that we decided to skip the first coffee break in favor of making sure that we can hear more from our speakers. And I think that was definitely the right choice since we just had an extremely exciting two first presentations. And now we're back on track. So I'll thank you again, Vitalik.